Good morning, everyone. One of the biggest economic questions of the year, of interest to both business leaders and policymakers, is how will artificial intelligence transform the way we work and how companies create value for their customers? Here at Washington Post Intelligence, we've been looking for early signals from various industries to help us discern what this coming transformation will look like. And today we're going to look at a sector that impacts almost all businesses and an area where Wall Street has signaled could be prone to major disruption. And that is enterprise software, also known as software as service or SaaS. I'm Luiza Savage, editorial director of WP Intelligence, and our mission is to help decision makers see around the corners of policy, industry, and technological developments. And every week at these briefings, we bring together our analysts and thought leaders across sectors to help us go quick and deep. Our subscribers to WP Intelligence also receive concise intelligence reports with actionable recommendations across AI and tech, energy and climate, global security, and healthcare. We have a graphics library, exclusive interviews, as well as newsletters. So today we're going to examine what is next for the software as service industry as the growing ability of AI agents suggests that many business functions could be automated, and new tools are making coding capabilities more broadly accessible. So to help us make sense of these newest developments and their long-term impacts, we have two people who are at the forefront of these discussions and decision-making. Jason Dean is our AI and tech analyst who's published several reports for us on how AI is beginning to transform various industries and their business models, including a recent report on SaaS, and he joins us from San Francisco. Great to see you, Jason.
Likewise. Good morning, Luiza.
And Nick Tzitzon is vice chairman of ServiceNow. ServiceNow is a major SaaS player. It's a cloud-based platform that helps businesses automate and manage digital workflows across IT, HR, customer service, security, and many other departments. They have $100 billion in market cap and 28,000 employees around the world. Nick is also a member of the WP Intelligence AI and Tech Council, and he's joining us from the Boston area. So great to have you this morning, Nick.
Thanks so much, Luiza. Great to be with you and Jason.
Well, thank you so much. So here's how we'll organize our conversation for the next hour. First, we're going to look at how AI is changing the landscape for software as service. Then we'll talk about how are the SaaS companies adapting. And third, we'll discuss what that means for all other companies who rely on software for many business functions from HR to sales. And I'd also like to thank our audience for all the questions you sent in ahead of the briefing. We've used them to help shape this conversation. And throughout the hour, I invite you to drop your questions and comments into the Q&A, and we'll take relevant questions as we go along. So thank you all for being here, and let's dive in. Jason, let's start with the moment that sort of brought all this into focus, which was known as the SaaSpocalypse. This was perhaps the first time that we saw Wall Street traders really punish stocks that they thought were vulnerable to AI. So what happened, and where are those stocks now?
Yeah, Luiza, there was something of a freak out among investors, and I think this is interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, everybody, as you said, is trying to figure out what impact AI is going to have on a range of industries. And second of all, everybody uses this software. So these concerns really started sort of late last year, and they really snowballed last month. Nominally, like the impetus was some new features and some of the latest big AI models that we're seeing as highlighting the risk. That was sort of the trigger. But the S&P's main software index at one point in February was down by well over a third from its peak last fall. It's recovered a bit. I think they're still down about 30% from the all-time high, and down about a fifth so far this year. And some of the biggest names in the industry have fared even worse. And just for comparison, the NASDAQ is down about 5% this year. So I think investors are anxious that these products from frontier AI models will be able to handle a lot of these SaaS tasks, and that also companies are shifting already some of their spending, their IT spending, toward Anthropic and OpenAI, away from existing SaaS companies. And just the nature of AI and its impact is upending the way that this SaaS is priced.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jason, you wrote a whole report for us called The SaaS Reckoning, How AI Will Change Business Software Buying. And I just want to start by just establishing how important this sector is right now to the corporate world.
I mean, it's huge. Obviously, every company uses not just one or two, but dozens, scores, maybe hundreds of enterprise software applications, and the industry has really evolved in a way that's made it even more important over the years. The innovation of software as a service, so this cloud-based software, has made it a lot easier to build software applications, and we've seen just in the last 5 years, worldwide spending on enterprise software has grown by 130%, according to Gartner, to 1.25 trillion. Yeah.
I think we have a chart.
That's right.
Of that spending. Maybe we could show the chart on screen and you could walk us through it.
Yeah. Let's see if we can get that up. There we go. So yeah, you can see the yellow section there, just which is software taking an ever widening share of IT spending, and of course, overall IT spending has been growing too. So it's been growing as a share of an ever enlarging pie. I think one other thing to think about is not just the growth in spending, but also in terms of the growth of importance. The nature of SaaS means more and more of companies' core information is now resides in these repositories that SaaS companies run. So you don't have all of your data in your own database on your own servers. It's a part of an app from ServiceNow or one of the many other companies that provide these services, and that is also a really critical part of the way that companies interact with SaaS.
No, that's fascinating. So Nick, you are vice chairman at a major SaaS company. How did the SaaS apocalypse look from where you were sitting? Probably not your favorite day of the year.
Well, Luiza, we've had better. I would say I've learned in a long career, it's not a winning strategy to challenge the right of investors to try to make judgment calls based on how they value equities. I would say that Jensen Huang, the founder and CEO of NVIDIA, has said that he thinks the street got it wrong. Obviously, he's got a quite different stature level at this point in the market than I do, so I'll let his words speak for themselves. I'll tell you two observations, one from the macro level. I can remember back in 2012 when I went to SAP, largest enterprise applications company. I remember reading prognostications that the transition to cloud computing and SaaS as a business model would effectively erode companies like SAP and Oracle, who had been leaders in on-premise software for a long time. Of course, both of those companies today, 15 years later, are much larger and much more valuable than it can be valuable. In the same sense, I remember reading that IBM's mainframe business had its best growth performance last year in 20 years. So technology, in terms of how it impacts and enters and deploys across the enterprise, is a methodical process. And oftentimes, first impressions about its effects are a bit different. At least that's what history shows. Mm-hmm. At a micro level, for ServiceNow, since you asked how I felt, I would have felt a whole lot worse if we hadn't been significantly investing in AI innovation for the last 10 years. So I think while it was a tough day to watch and a tough stretch to watch in the capital markets, I think we feel very confident and convicted that our role as the enterprise AI control tower is the right role to play.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to talk a lot more about that, how SaaS companies are adapting, but I'm really excited to talk about that, not just because I'm curious about your company, but just so many companies across the economy in so many sectors right now are trying to think of how they adapt. And so I really think this is just a microcosm that we can learn a lot from, both in terms of the directions you're taking and what you're hearing from your customers. So I'm really looking forward to digging into that. Jason, you wrote in your report, and I thought this was so interesting because I think it gets at some of these dynamics that maybe are of interest to companies across the board, that it doesn't necessarily make sense to assume that companies are just going to replace all their SaaS vendors with homegrown software or just switch all their spending to AI model companies. And so tell us a little bit about why. What are some of the considerations here?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that makes this moment difficult is there's been so much progress so quickly, and people don't know how to like extrapolate that line as we go further into the future. Will the curve, maintain its sharp up and to the right shape that it's had? Will it flatten? And so, there's been, I think, some overreaction, perhaps, of people extrapolating that what the impact of the progress we've already seen will be. Oh, look, OpenAI just added this or that feature, or I just vibe coded an app that can automate some of the tasks that's currently done by this or that SaaS app. So maybe businesses will root out and replace all of their SaaS. And, there's certainly going to be an impact. There already has been an impact. But the reality is that a lot of SaaS, particularly what's known as system of record software, very deeply embedded into clients. And there's a lot more to it than just a collection of code that can perform certain tasks. There's regulatory functions and processes that need constantly to be updated. There's security patching. There's other maintenance, service, and support. And so trying to replicate the totality of that is a lot more difficult than vibe coding one simple function, and probably doesn't make sense at this point for a lot of core software apps. That doesn't mean there aren't aspects of the software stack that companies can try to automate through agentic AI. It just means that it's a lot more complicated than perhaps some of the responses suggested.
Nick, what are you seeing from your customers? Are they trying to replace your software with homegrown AI? Or if not, why not?
Well, I think just to build quickly on the point Jason was making, let's look at the historical arc here. When SaaS or public cloud applications became prevalent in the market, what you had was a remarkable distribution of buying power in enterprises. So maybe in the decades before, you had a single buyer who was deciding which systems to invest in and what those systems should do. Now, all of a sudden, everybody who has budget authority in an enterprise is a tech buyer. So you saw this massive proliferation of applications across the enterprise that weren't integrated, that frankly made doing basic things across different functions incredibly hard because of the silo effect. And for the last several years, you've seen enterprises actively looking to consolidate and shrink enterprise application landscape to fewer strategic platforms. And that has actually been a huge tailwind for ServiceNow, which has positioned as the orchestration layer on top of all these different systems, platforms, and applications. So we don't see any appetite whatsoever to take on the risk of rationalizing this big mess of different systems and applications. And as an extension of that point, if you were working these past years to shrink your overly littered landscape with 1,000 points of dim technological light, why do you then open the floodgates to anybody with a cloud application who wants to vibe code an additional application on a weekend, when you just started to realize some of the benefits of platform consolidation? So I'm not saying there won't be interesting and exciting new use cases that AI advances allow for in the enterprise, but I think the core fundamental of what does it take to run an organization and what role should technology play to keep an organization stitched together, that is a responsibility, technologically speaking, that the commercial market is likely to serve for the decades to come.
Jason, one point that you made along those lines in your report is that as companies across the economy start to think about how to use AI, how to integrate it, they're not necessarily thinking about rejiggering old processes, existing processes. They're trying to figure out how to use it to grow. Can you talk about what you mean by that and what you're seeing?
Yeah, I think every company has finite resources for IT. They have finite resources for AI. The budget that they're allocating to it is obviously growing, but it is not unlimited. And companies have to make a decision. Like, am I going to try to pare my software spending by 10 or 20% here, using some of these resources, some of these precious engineers, the people who are expert in deploying AI solutions, or am I going to try to use that to figure out ways to improve our business, to enhance products, to grow sales, and certainly people like to cut costs, but I think a lot of the interest is in how can we use this to grow, and to grow with more efficiency. I think I quoted one VC as saying, you have this innovation bazooka with these AI models. Why would you point that at rebuilding CRM or payroll instead of using it to extend your core business advantage? So I think that plays into this calculus as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, so on that point, I want to sort of shift to looking at how software companies themselves are adapting. And Jason, you wrote about a new third age, you called it, of SaaS. So what are the first two ages and what is the third age?
Yeah, I mean, if software business has been through disruption before, as Nick alluded to earlier, we didn't start out with SaaS. We started out with what's called on-premise software, and companies used to pay, kind of once for software. They installed it on their computers, and maybe after several years, they would have to pay to upgrade it. Then you had, roughly 2 decades ago, a little more, you had the rise of cloud computing, and that's when this software as a service business model took off that sort of defines the second major era, which we're still in. And software is housed not on your own servers, but on cloud servers, and you're paying subscriptions, often historically over the last decade plus, based on the number of users that are using a particular app. And that really unlocked a lot. That ushered in an industry boom. It created it made it easier, as I said, to build software and build software companies. It made it easier to have software do more things. Is really kind of behind the phenomenon that Mark Andreessen, 2011, I think, coined the phrase "software is eating the world." At the early part of that era, and that has really proven true. It's taken on more and more functions. Of course, now people are quipping that AI is eating software, and I think in this phase that we're entering into now. With AI, it's obviously much more about AI, and the value of the software is increasingly about task completion, the work that AI can do for you, as opposed to like a tool that a certain number of employees can use. And I think that leads to new thinking about not just products, but about pricing, among other things.
Mm. So Nick, to what extent are you seeing that in your company? Are you ready to move away from seat-based pricing to a new pricing model?
Well, Louisa, we have a hybrid business model as it is. So we have a traditional subscription license that, frankly, for a lot of customers, offers the predictability and the reliability that, especially in complex macro environments, people want that. They don't necessarily look forward to um, uh, vendors of any kind coming back to them months later and saying, "Congratulations, things have been successful. Now you owe us much more money than you planned." So for a lot of customers, subscription pricing remains the primary vehicle that they're interested in. But we also have consumption pricing, and we have hybrid pricing that combines the two. So I think in these moments, you do your best in the technology industry by listening more closely and carefully to the different industries you serve, and being mindful of their needs. For example, in the public sector, which is a major area of focus for us, It's going to be very difficult for agencies that work on the appropriations process. You're seeing what's happening with DHS in terms of the funding battle at this very moment. The notion of variable pricing that can't be factored into an annual budgeting process is not realistic. So it's going to be incumbent on market leading companies at this moment in time to be flexible. If you offer customers options and you allow customers to experiment, you're going to be, I think, more favorably viewed as a long-term strategic platform partner than you will be if you insist on one form or another, even if that form you're insisting on is a new pricing model. So this is about adaptability and flexibility because no organization, depending on their industry, is really the same as another.
I think that's so interesting what you said about being a strategic partner. I feel like I've heard this phrase in many of the conversations we've done simply because we're in such uncharted territory, right? And so each company is trying to figure things out. They actually don't necessarily know how they want to do things. And with all their vendors, all their consultants, all their partner companies, it's almost like there's a sense of like everyone's in it together trying to figure out what this means both for client and for vendor, right?
Can I give you an example?
Yes,
Just
please.
right in real time. So we had a what we call them an executive briefing where you bring together a team from one of our big customers and you we experiment with it. We talk about different AI use cases, and the first 15 to 20 minutes um, were really introductions, not between the two teams, ours and theirs, but between people on their side. The organization was so big that you had people who had worked for that organization for decades who were meeting each other for the first time. So I think we sometimes oversimplify what it really means to help large organizations transform. We have this image that somehow they're just like are as individuals, like, oh, I went from version of my phone to the next version of my iPhone. Oh, I went from one cloud model to the next cloud model. No, organizations are completely different, and some of the basic human factors of large organizations simply will not keep pace with the technological change. And that's why it's so important to be in these relationships where you understand that those dynamics, where you don't incessantly push technology of your customer's ability to rationally consume it. And again, I think the platforms in technology that find that balance right and that prove that loyalty will do really well, and those that don't will be looked at in a totally different light.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. And to your point a few minutes ago about predictability in pricing, we have an audience question that came from a CTO at a financial services company. And they asked, with the potential collapse, so maybe it's not a collapse, of seat based pricing, from what you said, you're still offering hybrids. And vendors needing to make up that drop in revenue, plus the much higher computational costs of reasoning systems, how do we forecast expenses over the next 3 years?
Well, so my advice in that case would be twofold. I would say first, be careful with the assumption that seat-based pricing will collapse. I think, if you just look at our most recently publicly announced results, our monthly active user platform actually grew. And if all you did was look at available seats that our platform could address, we've only really addressed a small percentage of those available seats. Now, it's true, see some people move from one part of an organization to another, or you're likely to see some organizations adjust their size. But that by itself does not determine the long-term future of a seat-based pricing model. Now, having said that, if the enterprise judgment was to move to some form of consumption or value-based pricing, I think to the CTO's question, there's got to be a very, very clean mutual understanding of what constitutes value. For a long time, in bringing technology into enterprises, the idea of building a basic business case. If customer spends X, customer will receive value Y. That basic exercise has served as the fuel to increase investment into technology. I think there has to be incredible transparency. It has to exist on both sides, because that same chief technology officer has got to go upstairs to her or his CEO, and ultimately potentially to her or his boardroom, and say, there's going to be some potential short-term volatility in how we invest in technology, but here is the value equation we're building towards, and here's why we think the value is worth whatever short-term disruption might exist in how we fund it. And the vendors who actively participate in that process, the vendors who can build those business cases, who have total clarity, the desired business value, will be the ones that do well on this.
That's a really important takeaway, right? Just being super clear on the value. Jason, we're looking at SaaS today, but we've been covering just the same conversation across a number of industries that are being impacted early by AI and trying to figure out the future. And you've looked at industries like software, coding, like law, like consulting, where this conversation about pricing is happening. Just tell us a few examples of what you've heard when you've worked on those reports.
Yeah, I mean, you point to the law, and that's one of the areas where people are looking at the software impact, but there's also the human impact. A lot of what particularly early career lawyers do is in terms of scanning legal documents and trying to process and tease out particular facts, et cetera, is something AI is pretty good at. And that potentially, there's the question of how do you price the software and the AI products that you're selling to law firms, but then also how does that affect the pricing that law firms do, because they're doing their work based on an hourly billing for the most part, and if you're no longer billing lots and lots of hours because your junior associates are spending so much time reading through boxes and boxes of legal documents, that could affect the business. I think an interesting variable in all of this too is we do not actually have a real market-based sense of the cost of AI. And one of the fascinating things when we talk about AI-driven software is that historically, particularly in the SaaS era, one of the great things about being in the software industry has been the marginal cost is very low. The revenue you get from each additional customer far exceeds the cost to provide that. There's a little bit more server usage or whatever. That's not true with AI. Every time anybody uses AI, there is a compute cost associated with it that goes to. That's one of the reasons why NVIDIA is the most valuable company on the planet right now, and that means that there is cost associated with usage, and that's going to be cost to the providers as well as the end users. And right now we don't have a clear picture of that because so much of that cost is being subsidized by venture capitalists. The big model companies, OpenAI and Anthropic, are losing enormous amounts of money every year doing what they're doing. At some point, that's going to have to be priced at a level that makes them profitable. And the compute costs are coming down in some ways; they're going up in other ways. So I think that, and the questioner sort of got at this earlier, that puts a variable in it that makes it a little bit hard to forecast what cost is going to look like, over the next several years.
No, that's an excellent point. And so I want to move on to how the SaaS companies like Nick's are approaching AI in their offerings. But before we do, my biggest takeaway, I think, if I step back from any specific industry, my big picture takeaway is you have to be rethinking and having, as Nick was saying, the clear sense of what is your value that you're creating. And then what are the possible, pricing models around that? Those might change, but they have to make sense for you and they have to make sense for the clients. And I get the sense that just every industry is having to think about this right now and potentially could be learning from each other. Some of the sort of the from their key experiences what is working, because we're just entering a different era of how we price services, I think. Well, I'm curious if you guys agree with that, but Jason, and maybe I'll start with Nick. Talk about how you're thinking about the use of AI in what you do, and how it's helping you stay competitive and build your company for this AI era.
Well, I want to first say your summary is 100% aligned with reality. I think, AI right now is the answer to every question before people even know what the question is. And that's just sort of the nature of excitement in an emerging new technology that is moving very fast. Often, two or three basic follow-up questions sort of expose the relative immaturity of people's desire for AI. It's like, well, what exactly do you want it to do? What outcome are you trying to get to? I think people are working through it, like you said. For ServiceNow, again, we an AI platform for a long time, well before the first conversational models came out. Good old-fashioned analytical AI and pattern recognition, now conversational agentic AI. We think of agentic AI as the new frontier where enormous value will be created. Again, the tech industry, we love to over complexify everything. The basic concept of an agent, we can all relate as consumers to using travel agents 10, 15, even, on our most recent trips. If a single one-to-one relationship then results in multiple activities being conducted in service to that one-to-one relationship, if a human-to-human relationship can do it, a human-to-machine relationship can often do it. And so as you look at agentic and you look at the kind of work that has been automated through ServiceNow for a long time, we're seeing remarkable productivity increases where 90% in some cases of work that would have required human intervention 5 years ago is now being remediated by agents. And I think the opportunity that creates, I think to a point that you or Jason were making earlier, great news, because now you have people, you can rethink the work that you ask your people to do in terms of its relative ability to add value to the business or the organization you're to run.
I have to ask you, you said 90%. Now, give us an example of where productivity is increasing by 90%. That's a great number.
Yeah, I mean, for us, right, the basic foundational use case that many people know ServiceNow for is IT service. So Jason has an issue with his laptop, or in my case, I have an issue with my Wi-Fi connection, which is all too real. Those things would be manually raised as tickets, manually handled by a human agent, addressed, remediated, closed, and then reported on to document outcomes. Well, now I flag a situation I'm having, and the agent does all that, saving the person who might have done it, 2 years ago, to actually focus on real long-term strategic technology maneuvers that will help make us a better and stronger company. So it's remarkable, and it really does force this conversation of what do we want people to be focusing on as the AI agents become more mature and more capable.
Jason, you asked many of your sources how they gauge what service functions should be automated, what software functions should be automated with AI. What did they tell you?
Yeah, I think still AI is much better at automating consistent, repetitive tasks, and tasks where the critical data is well labeled and lives in documents that are accessible and can be processed by the AI system. So, think about things like certain payroll functions, scheduling software, customer service, along the same lines of IT support that Nick was just talking about. And as we talked about earlier, reading legal documents, it's less adept at taking over when the tasks are ad hoc, when they're reliant on human perception and judgment, or highly sensitive to error. I mean, sometimes you hear people in the AI business telling us that hallucination is largely a solved issue now. That's just not the case. Anybody who uses it knows that it's not, and so you still can't just give it free rein, particularly in areas where errors would be extremely problematic. So, things like medical drug trial management, or in terms of judgment, something like executive compensation, not regular payroll issues, anything where there's complex regulatory or compliance related evaluation. And I think another way to think of it is a lot of the sort of, as I said before, the systems of record kind of functions where the software is functioning as a centralized source of critical information and requires precise data integrity and auditing. That's going to be harder for AI to displace. What they call systems of engagement that might focus more on productivity or collaboration. It could be easier to replicate in ways that I think those of us who use generative AI regularly can see.
Mm-hmm. So I want to encourage our audience to make sure they send in their questions in the Q&A tab while we still have time to answer them. I do want to take one audience question that asked about what will the impact of AI software changes have on the sales process? They mentioned Salesforce. Obviously, we don't have Salesforce represented on the panel, but I wonder if either of you would like to tackle that.
Well, I think for the industry, again, sales is a remarkably different function depending on whether you're selling direct to consumers or you're selling to other enterprises. In our case, we have seen remarkable benefits to effectively putting a conversational AI coach in the pocket of every one of our customer-facing professionals. So historically, when you think about how to prep somebody to be in front of their customer, manual process. Even when you had sort of automated CRM, people routing through bases, looking for information, going online, researching businesses, pulling PDF documents of annual reports, as opposed to what you have now is the ability to effectively simulate conversation with someone in specific industry with a specific set of business challenges, and the preparation we're seeing is immense. We likewise have seen with new platforms like Itrame as an example, which is an AI coaching interface that allows you to simulate a real-time conversation with somebody that you're ultimately meeting with, and the simulation will talk you through what you did well, what messages you didn't land, and what messages came through loud and clear. So we're trying to put these tools and many more in front of our customer-facing professionals because, frankly, the more you can help them feel confident that they've lived through the real scenario, the more effective they're going to be in the real scenario.
So it may be that the AI is helping improve the humans in that scenario that you're describing. I'm curious, Nick, to what extent do you think of the big AI companies like Anthropic or OpenAI as your competition at this point as they continue to roll out new products?
Well, they're certainly partners. We have announced partnerships with all of them, frankly, and most recently with OpenAI and Anthropic. I like using both of those platforms, and I think they're going to be exciting, hopefully soon, public companies, if the rumors and speculation are true. I think the entire enterprise technology landscape is full of partners in one sense and friendly competition in another sense. At the end of the day, we're all competing for what I would call art of the possible with the enterprises we work with. We just have different tools to bring to that process. So in ServiceNow's case, we have highly deterministic workflows that are 100% reliable, where we know exactly how work is done. We know how to get a process from one system or one team to another, whereas our foundation model company partners bring a probabilistic model to that situation, which is highly conversational, that can utilize substantial swaths of internet to give you great sort of active information when you need it. We ultimately think that the customer will do better in the end if we see each other as partners, but obviously always just in the friendly spirit of being in the same industry, with the sure knowledge that sometimes those partnerships might overlap into some competition. But we take the partnership view first and foremost at this stage.
Mm-hmm. Jason, you described in your report sort of 4 scenarios for business software products. You want to talk us through what that scenario looks like?
Yeah, this is based on a rubric that Bain put together that I found interesting. So in one group, you have apps and sectors where AI mainly enhances SaaS. These is kind of the areas I was talking about before, with lower levels of user automation, higher reliance on human judgment, clinical trial randomization, for example, where it's not going to displace existing software. It'll enhance it. There's others where AI is able to outshine sort of the traditional versions of software, but the incumbents still have a lot of sway because they control a lot of the data and the workflows, and they'll have kind of a head start in this if they're aggressive about embracing AI, as a lot of the SaaS companies are. I think there's some areas where, in a third category, AI will just cannibalize SaaS, certain functions of SaaS anyway, invoice processing and time entry approvals and things like that fit in the sort of repeat, sort of very structured tasks that we talked about earlier. And then some areas where, like, overall spending, it's not going to be somebody stealing pieces of the pie. The pie is going to shrink because it's just so easy for AI to do certain things like list building and task boards, scheduling software. That I think is a lot of people are already using AI for that. And so there you might just see the revenue that exists in those areas shrink.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm curious what you make of that, Nick, of those 4 scenarios.
I largely agree with the framing. It won't surprise either of you. I agree with the focus on where sort of established, mature, scaled global platforms will be irreplaceable. You think about just the requirements to globalize any technology. You have highly unique regulatory environments. You have data privacy regulations that often differ by markets. Now you have data residency requirements, particularly in Europe. Um, you have risk and security thresholds. These are just considerations that take time to build reliably into any platform. And there are certain core business foundational functions. In our case, the notion of being an AI control tower and regulating the different AI deployments you have, and making sure that you understand whose AI was built where, what data does it have access to, can you give it different permissions for one agent being used by one colleague than maybe the same agent being used by a different colleague? Can you discover all of your devices, either IT devices, operational technology devices, integrate that entire landscape so that you have one common view? uh, we don't see a scenario where that's something that let's replace that or let's build that on our own. No, I think that the far greater likelihood is that they will look to us and they want to hold a long-standing industry partner accountable for those outcomes. So I agree with the framing. I do think the parts that are irreplaceable are perhaps not as widely understood today as they will be in the weeks and months to come.
No, that's really interesting. And we have this pre-submitted audience question saying, with every vendor offering an agentic solution at some point, how does an enterprise coordinate or orchestrate multiple agentic systems? And where does the enterprise big brain live so that knowledge and decision rights aren't fragmented? And I take from your previous comment, that's where you see a role for your company.
Oh, absolutely. And I think we've done this before is part of the story. Our configuration management database, which is CMDB for short, which isn't something that is normally conversational, outside of the tech industry, is how most organizations keep track of the different devices, what's running on those devices, who has access to them. So the modernized version of the CMDB, with the CMDB embedded in its core, is this notion of an AI control tower. And maybe one thread I would pull on is the notion of identity. So for a human employee in an organization, you both have Washington Post badges. The Washington Post knows you both. You're given access to a secure door. You're able to badge into certain, technology assets, et cetera, et cetera. We need to think, and we are thinking about, how do you identify AI assets in the same way? Because only when you understand the identity of these AI assets running across your enterprise can you have any shot at organizing them, orchestrating them, and securing them. And we think identity is going to be a central thesis in how you accomplish that interoperability and that governance.
So one theme I'm picking up from many of our conversations around AI is people expect and need a certain level of personalization. And does that mean that if you're offering a software as service, it's no longer like, here's our software, subscribe, how many seats do you want? It feels like you're almost going in and doing something much more like consultancy and kind of bespoke. Is that like the correct impression that where this is headed?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to take it. I would say, the idea of customizing or configuring enterprise software is as old as enterprise software. It has gone through different phases. For example, when organizations first deployed big ERP systems, 30, 40 years ago, the customizations attached to those systems were legendary. And to this day, many organizations are still trying to figure out, what do I do with the things that we customized in systems that we built and deployed 30, 40 years ago? Today, because the technology is moving so fast, there are many, call them project-based AI deployments, where organizations want to look at a problem here and then examine how you can use AI to solve this particular problem in our unique way. Um, what we see is that's a critical part of the engagement strategy. But over time, again, thinking about the lessons of history, organizations understand how anything they do with AI today ultimately becomes scalable, because you're not just going to use it in an isolated use case, how it becomes integrated into other things that you're doing at the same time, so that it's a long-term viable part of your enterprise technology landscape.
Got it. Well, I'd like to move on to talking about implications here for business leaders who are our clients and who are thinking about their technology stack. Jason, in your report, you had some recommendations for business leaders. What do they need to be doing right now and thinking about right now as these changes take place?
Yeah, I think they need to be exploring these new pricing models, experimenting for certain products in particular. There will seat-based pricing will continue, but there is definitely a lot of pressure to shift away from that. There will be pressure from the SaaS companies too, because in some cases, the client companies are going to be automating aspects of this. That means they need fewer users, and so for the SaaS companies, you don't want to be, you don't want that revenue shrinking. So I think there will be a shift towards usage-based models to success-based models. So in customer service, for example, a lot of the AI customer service companies are pricing based on the number of tickets that they close. And that's a doable thing in that area, and one that can be measured fairly easily. It'd be harder for something like CRM, sales software, because what salesperson is going to say, yes, the responsibility for that successful sale goes to the software. So there are going to be different models, I think, based in different functions and different types of software, and starting to understand how that works now is going to be really important for the reasons Nick said earlier. It's not necessarily as transparent. It's fairly simple if you're like, this is the price per seat, this is the number of seats, do the multiplication. in the future, how do you measure success? How do you measure usage? How do you price tokens? Are they all going to be priced the same? Are some tokens going to be more valuable than others? Tokens being kind of the units of text that large language models use. So I think sort of getting your head wrapped around that so that you can understand the value that you're paying for as a customer and how to price that value on your end and how to be transparent about it is going to be really important. And then I think also, trying to maintain flexibility in contract terms. I'm not sure Nick will agree with that, but it seems like it's a moment where flexibility is really valuable because of all of the uncertainty that we've been talking about, and maximizing your ability to adjust the terms as time goes on. And it's a fairly short time frame. We're talking about massive changes over a single year in some cases, or even less. Also, your ability to move your data around and not get locked into individual vendors, particularly some of these newer companies that have only been around for a short amount of time, and who knows how much longer they will be around.
What about you, Nick? What advice would you give to other companies as your industry goes through the AI moment?
Well, maybe we'll tackle Jason's contract flexibility. I would say, there's a concept called reference architecture, which, is a sort of a technological term that describes a picture. And if you look at this picture, you can tell what every layer of your enterprise stack, technology stack, is intended to accomplish and how it all fits together. I would say even 10 years ago, leaders outside of the chief information officer or the chief technology officer would have absolutely no reason to give a second thought to a reference architecture. Whereas today, I think what is architecture and how do we rationalize that against all the different experiments is a topic that CEOs and boards of directors should be mindful of. You sort of have these two things happening, right? You have this experimentation culture, which I actually think a lot of organizations are getting a bit tired of, because proofs of concept and experiments, if you've done too many at one time, often run against each other, and it's hard to tell which ones are successful and which aren't. So you have experimentation on one side, and you have long-term modernization happening on the other side. Those two things have to be looked at through a single lens. Because if you can look at the single lens and say, okay, I understand how we're modernizing our technology landscape to make us a more competitive, more modern, more efficient organization. And I also understand where our moonshot projects, where we have reason to believe that we can accomplish fundamentally different business models. We can, as Jason said earlier, go for growth, where we can, perhaps look at new ecosystems across industries. Those projects should be done, but not at the expense or separate from the long-term modernization. So that would be my advice, Luiza. Look at both in a single lens.
That is fascinating. We have a very practical question here from one of our readers. How do we put the right guardrails in place around agentic AI systems in areas like finance and health, where companies need to adhere to strict rules and procedures? This came up a little bit earlier in Jason's comment, but I just wonder if you can quickly give some advice there, Nick.
Yeah, I think, again, I think governance of AI is as important as value from AI. No one that I've ever spoken to has any plans to rip out their automated general ledger, because it works and because it tends to keep companies out of trouble in highly regulated areas. So if you're going to give AI agents access to running across your general ledger and your core financials, what exactly do you want them to do? What data do they need access to in order to do that specific thing? And what data do they not need access to? And then, as an add-on to that, be very careful. We all need to be very careful about authorizing agents to make changes to your systems. It's one thing to pull information and relay it. It's another thing altogether for agents to go in and alter your master files, your master data files. So I think the more specific, we made this point earlier, Luiza, the more specific we can be on what exactly do we want the outcomes to be, the clearer we can be about drawing lines around where we don't need to open up an additional access point to sensitive data that determines whether or not an organization runs viably.
Excellent. Well, you've given us so much homework to think about. I think anyone who runs an organization right now, there's so much they need to be thinking about, and the CEOs need to be sitting down, obviously, with the CTOs and looking really critically, because these are big questions that go to the foundation of the competitiveness of every company, and not just rethinking the technology, but rethinking how they create value, how they define that, and just taking that away from so many of the conversations that we're having. I think it's absolutely fascinating. So I really appreciate sort of the depth and thoughtfulness that you have both brought to this conversation. In all our briefings, we like to take 60 seconds just to talk about what you're each focused on next. Jason, what do you have coming up for us, for our readers next?
I have next up a piece coming soon about what companies need to do to prepare for quantum computing's impact on encryption. It's going to fundamentally change the way that companies protect sensitive data.
That's another big piece of homework for our audience. So thank you for that. And Nick, what are you working on next?
I think there's two exciting things for us. One is we have a new platform as part of ServiceNow called MoveWorks, which is effectively giving a conversational AI layer that rests on top so that every employee in every organization can interact with every business or government service that they have access to with a conversational interface. So that's very exciting. We're seeing a lot of interest in that. And the second is this notion of autonomous IT, which it goes to a little bit the example, Luiza, we talked about earlier, but how can CIOs in particular have the pole position in running a function that is majority automated through AI agents so that they can reallocate their human talent and all the skills therein to different higher value tasks. So those are two areas that we're very focused on.
Excellent. Both very interesting. So thank you both so much for all your thoughts and everything that you've been thinking about and working on. Obviously, how AI is changing business models across industries is something we're going to continue covering closely at WP Intelligence. Before we wrap, a quick reminder to our audience that you can request a WP Intelligence platform demo by clicking the link on your screen. And we will send everyone who registered for today's briefing a recording so you can catch up or share if you need to. And please do take a moment to fill out the very short survey we send you. We appreciate your feedback, and it directly shapes what we do next. And please join us next Friday for a briefing. I'll be here with our lead energy analyst, Catherine Clay, who will be giving us all her updates from CERAWeek, which is the biggest annual energy conference that takes place in Houston next week at this critical moment for the energy sector between the AI energy demand boom and the oil and gas price shock from the war in Iran. It will be an absolutely fascinating conversation. In the meantime, have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you next week.